Well, thanks for having me here today, ladies and gentlemen. As I look around the room, I think a lot of people here might be able to remember the 1982 Commonwealth Games in Melbourne with Matilda the Winking Kangaroo. But for me, I was in grade 9 over in Perth, and I loved my sports. And I remember the 1982 Commonwealth Games because Tracy Wickham, she was a star then, Lisa Forrest, Lisa Curry, and Rob De Castella. I think he won his first major marathon. But if we sort of go back those 35 years and see what's happened in the economy, the Australian economy's done pretty well. It's average growth of about 3.1%, supported by pretty reasonable population growth. But the story for Queensland, I think, is even more impressive. Over that 35-year period, Queensland's real economic growth has grown by 3.7%, supported by stronger population growth of nearly 2% a year. So that's a pretty good achievement both for Australia and for Queensland. But I don't think we can really get ahead of ourselves. It might have been 35 good years, but things are a little bit tougher the last few years. I'm sure everyone in this room is aware of that. And here's Queensland's economic growth, gross state product in nominal terms. You can see it really boomed pretty much through the entire period from 1996 through to 2008, just before the global financial crisis hit, then a couple of good years. But the last 4 years, growth has really pared back. And if we just flick over and have a look at what's happening in real terms, similar sort of picture, whereas real economic growth in Queensland averaged about 5% through those boom periods, it's growing at closer to 2% over the last 4 or 5 years. So if we have a look at what might be driving that, again, no surprises here. We all know about the LNG boom that happened from about 2011, 2012 onwards, and obviously that investment is dried right up. The bars there are work yet to be done, and then the line is actual construction work that has been done. A consequence of that is that Queensland's job creation performance is tailed off a little bit. You see that in the period up to about 2009, Queensland's jobs growth was much faster than the Australian average, but since then it's pared back a bit. And this is a lot of interest to me as a retailer because we care about household confidence, and a big part of a driver of confidence is having a job. As I said, you can see that maybe Queensland's a bit more volatile with its employment growth, but certainly since about 2009, jobs growth in Queensland has been a bit less than the Australian average, although there actually are some good signs just the last couple of months there for Queensland. As a consequence of that, you can see that whereas Queensland used to have an unemployment rate that was well below the Australian average, said from about 2009 as employment growth slowed a bit, it's now a bit higher than the average. And if we go around the regions, this is just an average of the unemployment rates in these regions over the course of this calendar year. You can see that areas like, where one's popped off there, Townsville's up the top there, that's a bit above the average, as is Wide Bay, Harvey Bay, and then below the state average is the Darling Downs, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast. If I just go back to the labour market, I think this is really important in understanding what's happening both with the Australian economy and with the Queensland economy. Here's the unemployment rate. You see that it's sort of ticked up a bit, but it's still well below where it got to after the 1990s recession. But at the same time, the Bureau of Statistics surveys households about whether they've got a job and asks those people who are in a job whether they would actually like to work more hours. And that's what's known as the underemployment rate. And if you add together the underemployment rate with the unemployment rate, you get what's known as the underutilisation rate. Or that's really a sense of the spare capacity in the economy. And you can see that it's reasonably high here in Queensland, and the story is the same for Australia. What happens if you have spare capacity in the labour market? Well, wages tends to be lower. You've got less bargaining power because labour markets aren't tight. And we can see here that this is a story for Queensland and again for Australia, that wages growth has really died away since about 2009, 2010. And we're in this situation where wages growth in Australia is actually at historical lows. It's running at about 2%, and that's both for Queensland and for Australia. If I just flick over to Australia now, let's have a look at what's happened to real wages. So real wages give you a sense of spending power, purchasing power. That's wages at growth ahead of inflation. And you can see that for Australia, real wages growth has actually been negative for the best part of about three or 4 years. What happens if real wages growth is negative? Real household disposable incomes. Suddenly the growth there has dried up, and you can see that, again, the last couple of years, real household disposable income per capita has barely grown. And the purple line there is a measure that NATSEM, the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling, put. That's just a 5-year change in living standards. And so you can see back in about 2009, it was almost 15-20% higher than it was 5 years ago, whereas at the moment it's barely higher than it was. What's a consequence of that? One consequence of that is that real household spending is actually dropped down. That's just decade averages. This is again for Australia. You can see that the 2010 so far, real household consumption is running at about 1% versus a long-run average of 2%. Similar sort of story for Queensland. Here's one of my favourite charts. It's just a combination of employee income. That's really payroll. Right, so you just think of jobs growth plus wages growth. For employers, payroll's a cost, but for employees, workers around the state, around the country, that's income. And we can see that growth in payroll has really died away, and that's coincided with softer spending as well. So I guess that's just a real quick snapshot of what's happening in the economy. Investments come off, and households and consumers are cautious in their spending behaviour. Now, to just share with you a little bit of information which is sort of relevant to what I do at Coles, and quite interesting. I think you'll find this interesting as well. So we've got a very diverse customer base. Something like 16, 17 million people visit our supermarkets each week, and it's about 20 million once you include our liquor stores and convenience sites as well. But there's no one customer, but I've sort of broken them up into 3 groups here. So we've got singles and young couples, a bit under a third of our customers. We've got couples with children under the age of about 18, and that's a bit over a third. And then we've also got older shoppers. Not meant to be rude, that's anyone over the age of 55 for these purposes. When I have a look at some of the information that the federal government puts out, there's a couple of things that I really concentrate on. One is the family tax benefit. And family tax benefit is essentially it's a payment. It's supposed to be a tax cut, but it's just cashed out. And it's a payment that's available to families with young children, school-aged children, who are earning sort of up to $110,000 a year. So they're not really doing it. They're not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. And the Department of Human Services puts out summaries by electorate and also by postcode of the number of people in various areas who are receiving family tax benefit payments. I think this is quite interesting because it shows you where sort of, I won't call them struggling families, but families doing it a bit tougher are located. And so in around Brisbane, you can see that the biggest area is Rankin, which is sort of down Logan Way. It's Craig Emerson's old seat. We sort of go around to some of the outer areas, Petrie, Longman up to Caboolture, a lot of families, young families there, and even out in the regions, up at Leichhardt, Warren Inch territory, and also Herbert in around Townsville, which is, I suppose, a lot of families of Defence Force personnel. And so it's just really interesting to see where those people are located, the families with highest proportion of family tax benefit recipients. And as I said, the main takeout from that is that a lot of them are in the outer metro areas of Queensland and surrounds. If we flick over to age pensioners, and again, it's sort of interesting here because the age pension's linked to wages growth in Australia. It's linked to movements in male average weekly earnings. When wages are growing at 3.5%, that flows through to higher pensions. When wages are growing at 2%, the pension increases tend to be a bit lower. And again, if we go around the grounds, you can see Petrie, again, a very high proportion of people on the age pension. Here, interesting, Hinkler, up around Harvey Bay. I think Bundaberg might be there as well, down to around the Gold Coast, which no surprise there that there's lots of people on the age pension down there. And even if we go around to regional Australia, again, it's Maranoa and and Kennedy. So again, it just gives you a bit of a sense of where the customers are. We know that they're doing it a bit tougher now, that some of them are starting to feel like cost of living pressures. We've actually got a piece of work that we've been doing at Coles and we hope to put out in a couple of weeks, and I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a flavour of what's been happening. And one of the things that we do at Coles is we have all this great customer data sort of comes through, and what we do by each store is we have a look at the spending per person, per product across categories. And so you can go to a certain store and you find that all the people in this store, when they're buying their deli products or whatever, the average spend is it might be a small amount. If you go to another store which is a bit more affluent, it's higher, and so on and so forth. And so we get what's known as a customer price sensitivity score. And so this is the score across about 160 of our stores in Queensland. And as you go up, customers are more price sensitive. And it's sort of quite interesting, gives you a bit of a sense of their mood, whether that's changing or not. This is data, it's a little bit old, it's sort of from about FY16, maybe just after that. And the other interesting thing about this is, in some ways, it confirms a lot of what you'd expect, because the price sensitivity, customers are more price sensitive, tend to be in areas where there's sort of lower socioeconomic indicators. Anyway, what I've done is I've pulled out 6 stores across Queensland, starting up at Mareeba, Townsville, Emerald, we've got that, Hervey Bay, Dalby, and then Toombul, just to get you a sense of what's happening in Queensland. And you can see, it looks like a couple of them have dropped off, but you know, there's some pretty reasonable customer numbers come through those stores each week, sort of 18,000, 19,000, some of the regional stores. Emerald and Dalby a bit smaller, and then Toombul, one of our bigger stores, has about 30,000 customers a week. We can see where they're placed in terms of customer price sensitivity. And so Hervey Bay, I said we're probably a lot of aged pensioners are up there. Townsville, the families, down through where we've got Dalby, Mareeba. Emerald sort of surprised, maybe it's a little bit more affluent there, and then Toombul. And if we just convert those numbers, just pull them out, and so what we're finding is any sort of customer price sensitivity score that's above about 110, 112, people are starting to get pretty a bit more price sensitive. And then once it gets above 130, 140, they're starting to get very price sensitive. And so you can see some of those scores. How does that convert into their spending behaviour? Well, the customers are a bit more price sensitivity, no surprises. They tend to buy more items on everyday low prices, the more the value side of things. Likewise, here's the sales of private label bread, just a deviation from the national average. And again, you can see that the areas where there's more greater price sensitivity, those sales tend to be higher. And another interesting one is spending on fresh produce. This is deviation from the national average. A little bit surprising here. You look at some of the areas in, say, out of Metro Melbourne and Sydney where price sensitivity is higher. The spending on fresh produce tends to be much lower, whereas it's held up fairly well here. A little bit lower there in Dalby, and maybe that just reflects the fact that there's so much good fresh produce that's available in Queensland. So anyway, it's a little bit of a sense of what we're seeing with customers. And so we'll be putting this material out in a couple of weeks in a bit more detail across the entire country, so that's something to look out for. Just one last thing, it's more a plea than anything in terms of trading hours. I was on the plane flying down from Melbourne this morning reading the Queensland budget papers. I mean, it's a very, I thought, quite a good, well-argued, coherent plan about what needs to be done. I think a lot of the economic story was quite similar to what I presented at the start, but as I read through it, what was interesting was there was a line in there about one of the objectives is to try to get a bit more economic activity going, and I think everyone in this room would endorse that. But what we find in Queensland, it's got slightly more restricted trading hours than some of the other states around the country. And here's just a couple of examples of, ideally, Coles supermarket, we don't want to trade 24 hours a day everywhere because you just wouldn't get the customers coming through. Yeah, it'd be nice to do sort of 6 to 10, even 7 to 9 is not too bad. And to give the Queensland government credit that they did liberalise arrangements around southeast Queensland. We'd probably like a bit more trading activity happening on the Sunday. Again, the rest of Queensland, This is where a lot of those, with the exception of Toombul, the other 5 stores, I think they fall into this category. And they only trade for about an average of 80, 83 hours a week versus something like 93 or even 100 in some of the stores elsewhere. And then you've got the tourist precincts, obviously slightly more liberal trading hours. And we've got these 6-day traders. We've actually got 3 stores in Queensland where we can't trade on the Sunday, and that's Ayr, Mount Isa and Goondiwindi. And we actually had the ridiculous situation a few weeks ago in the lead up to Cyclone Debbie, where the cyclone was expected to hit sort of either Monday or Tuesday, and people were wanting to come into our stores to stock up, and actually we couldn't open it on Sunday. And we actually had the mayor of Ayr on the phone to us saying, please open your store up. And it was a bit of a, we wanted to, but Wesfarmers gets a bit touchy if we don't obey the law, so we had to be a bit careful there. So anyway, it's just to plea I think the Queensland government did try to liberalise trading hours earlier in the year, and it was regrettable that the opposition didn't support that. And so again, if we're sort of going back to really trying to get the state going, get the activity going, well, maybe opening some of those stores slightly more hours would be a good thing. So anyway, that's about it from me. Just to wrap up, really just want to impress, and I do this everywhere I talk to my colleagues at Coles elsewhere, that family budgets are doing it pretty tough. And so we've really got to respond to that by making sure there's a good value offer. There are challenges in terms of getting some broader based economic growth going, but I think in all of this, and it's up to us, it's up to businesses, it's up to our leaders, our political leaders, to really start talking the place up. There are some big challenges, but I think there's so much going for it in Queensland in particular. You've got the Commonwealth Games in the Gold Coast next year, and I think that could give a real fill up. So anyway, best of luck with today. I think I'd like to congratulate CEDA for putting this on. I've enjoyed coming up here, and I'm going to enjoy listening to the other speakers. And so on that, I'll now ask Peter Locke from Heritage Bank to come up. Thank you very much.